In the pristine living room of their Connecticut estate, a 72-year-old woman was about to face the ultimate betrayal. What started as an ordinary Tuesday evening routine took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her husband's devastating announcement. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't your typical suburban housewife. For 50 years, she had spent her life quietly observing and methodically documenting, known for her sharp legal mind hidden beneath a facade of domestic perfection. When she encountered Richard's casual dismissal of their marriage, she had no idea she was walking into the fight of her lifetime. Eleanor's composed response that would lead to the complete destruction of everything her husband had built. What began as a moment of devastating betrayal would become a masterclass in strategic warfare. The affluent community of Hartford would never be the same after witnessing how thoroughly an underestimated woman could dismantle the empire of the man who dared to replace her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Hartwell had always believed that Tuesday evenings possessed a particular kind of peace. For 50 years, she and Richard had fallen into the same rhythm. Dinner at 6:30, the evening news at 7, and by 8 o'clock, Richard would retreat to his study while she settled into her reading chair with a cup of chamomile tea. The routine had become as natural as breathing, a comfort that spoke of lives lived in harmony. But this Tuesday, October 15th, felt different from the moment Richard walked through the front door. He didn't kiss her cheek as usual, didn't ask about her day or comment on the scent of rosemary chicken that still lingered in the air. Instead, he stood in their pristine living room, surrounded by 5 decades of carefully curated memories, and studied her with the detached expression of a man appraising real estate. "We need to talk, Eleanor." She looked up from her needlepoint. The same piece she'd been working on for 3 months. A garden scene with delicate pink roses that reminded her of their honeymoon in England. Her fingers stilled on the silk thread. "Of course. How was your day?" "The Henderson project." "I'm leaving you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Eleanor's hands remained frozen above her needlework, the needle catching the light from the crystal lamp Richard had given her for their 25th anniversary. She heard the grandfather clock in the hallway tick once, twice, 3 times before the meaning penetrated. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" Richard moved to the mantelpiece, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in the pose she'd seen him adopt countless times during business meetings. When he was about to deliver news that would change everything for someone else. "I said I'm leaving you, Eleanor. I've found someone else. Someone who understands what I need at this stage of my life." Eleanor set down her needlepoint with the same care she'd used to handle their newborn children decades ago. Her movements felt disconnected from her thoughts, as if she were watching someone else's hands perform these simple actions. "Someone else," she repeated, her voice steady despite the way her heart had begun to hammer against her ribs. "Her name is Melissa Chen. She's been my secretary for 2 years now, but we've grown close." He turned to face her. Then, and Eleanor saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not shame or regret, but impatience. As if her shock was an inconvenience he needed to manage efficiently. "Your secretary." Eleanor's voice remained level, though she felt as if the floor beneath her chair had suddenly turned to quicksand. "The young woman with the MBA. She's 35, not a child. And yes, she has her MBA from Wharton. She understands business, understands ambition. She doesn't see my work as something that takes me away from her. She sees it as something we can build together." Eleanor understood now. This wasn't a confession born of guilt or a plea for forgiveness. This was a business presentation. Richard was explaining his decision to terminate their partnership, and he expected her to accept the terms with the same grace she'd shown through 50 years of marriage. "How long?" she asked. "Does it matter?" "How long, Richard?" He sighed. The sound of a man forced to provide unnecessary details to a client who couldn't grasp the bigger picture. 8 months. Maybe 9. 8 months. Eleanor's mind cataloged the recent past with sudden, devastating clarity. The late meetings that had become more frequent. The weekend conferences that required him to be away for entire weekends. The way he'd started showering and changing clothes before coming home, claiming he needed to wash off the day's stress. The gifts. Eleanor's gaze moved to the diamond earrings sitting in the small china dish on the side table. A thinking of... You present Richard had given her just last month. Had he bought them for Melissa first? Had she worn them while they... I've found an apartment in Hartford, Richard continued, his tone growing more brisk, more businesslike. I'll be moving out this weekend. I've already spoken to the children. This detail landed like a physical blow. You told our children before you told me? I wanted to prepare them. Victoria was upset. Jimmy took it better. He understands that these things happen. And Maggie, well, you know how she is about change. Eleanor stared at her husband of 50 years, this man she'd met when she was 22 and believed she'd grow old with, and realized she was looking at a stranger. Not because he had changed, but because she was finally seeing him clearly. The charm that had swept her off her feet in 1975 was still there, but now she could see it for what it was, a tool he used to get what he wanted. The confidence she'd admired was actually entitlement. The way he'd always made decisions for both of them wasn't protective. It was controlling. When you say you've spoken to the children, Eleanor said quietly, did you tell them why you're leaving? Did you tell them about Melissa? Richard's jaw tightened slightly. I told them we'd grown apart, that we want different things now. We. Eleanor, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. She stood then, her legs somehow still able to support her despite feeling like water. At 72, Eleanor Hartwell was still an elegant woman, tall, with silver hair she wore in a neat chignon, and the kind of understated style that came from decades of knowing exactly who she was, or who she'd thought she was. More difficult than it needs to be, she repeated. Richard, you've just told me you're ending our 50-year marriage for a woman young enough to be our daughter. You've informed our children before bothering to have this conversation with me. You've made unilateral decisions about the dissolution of our shared life. Exactly how much easier did you expect this to be? For the first time since he'd walked through the door, Richard looked uncomfortable. I thought you'd understand. We haven't been happy for a long time, Eleanor. We've been going through the motions. We have? You have to admit we've grown distant. When was the last time we really talked? When was the last time you showed any interest in my work, my dreams, my future? Eleanor felt something cold and sharp begin to crystallize in her chest. Your dreams, your future. When you speak about us growing distant, Richard, what you really mean is that I stopped being useful to you. That's not what isn't it? She moved closer to him, and she saw him take an involuntary step backward. For 50 years, I've supported your dreams. I gave up my career as a legal secretary to raise our children and manage our home so you could build your business. I hosted your clients, entertained your colleagues, smiled, and played the perfect wife at every company function. I listened to your problems and celebrated your successes, and never once complained when you missed dinner, missed birthdays, missed anniversary celebrations because work came first. Richard's mouth opened, but Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. And now that you're 74 and facing the reality that your empire won't make you immortal, you've decided you need someone young and ambitious to make you feel relevant again. Someone who sees your success and doesn't remember the price. The rest of us paid for it. Eleanor, you're being dramatic. Am I? She smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. You know what's dramatic, Richard? A 74-year-old man throwing away his family for a 35-year-old employee. You know what's pathetic? A man who thinks his worth is determined by how young a woman he can convince to sleep with him. Richard's face flushed red. You don't understand. Melissa and I have a real connection. She appreciates me in ways you never have. I'm sure she does, especially when she looks at your bank account. That's enough. Richard's voice turned sharp, and Eleanor recognized the tone he used when his business deals were threatened. I didn't want it to be like this, but you're forcing my hand. I'm leaving, Eleanor. Tonight. I've already moved most of my things. Eleanor looked around their living room, and noticed what she should have seen immediately. The spaces on the bookshelves where Richard's first edition business biographies had been. The empty spot on the side table where his gold watch usually sat overnight. The missing crystal paperweight his father had given him. He'd been stealing pieces of their life for months, preparing for this moment while she'd continued to set. 2 places at the dinner table. You've been planning this for a long time, she said. I've been planning my future, yes. Melissa and I. We're going to travel. She wants to see Europe, Asia. We're going to live, Eleanor. Really live. With my money. Richard's expression grew cold. With our money? Which, after 50 years of marriage, becomes divided equitably. Connecticut is a no-fault state, Eleanor. We'll each get our fair share. Eleanor watched her husband gather his coat and briefcase, moving with the efficiency of a man who had planned every detail of this evening, except for one thing. Richard, she said as he reached for the door handle. He turned back, impatience written across his features. Do you remember our prenuptial agreement? He laughed, actually laughed. Eleanor, that was 50 years ago. A sweet gesture from a young woman who thought she was being modern. It's not worth the paper it's written on after all this time. You never read it, did you? Of course I read it. It was standard boilerplate. You were protecting your little secretarial salary. His smile was patronizing, the same expression he'd worn when she'd asked questions about his business deals over the years. Eleanor nodded slowly. I see. Well, I suppose we'll both be learning some interesting things in the coming days. Richard stared at her for a moment, and Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, cross his face. But then he straightened his shoulders and opened the door. I'll be in touch about the details. Try to be reasonable about this, Eleanor, for everyone's sake. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Eleanor was alone in the house they'd shared for 3 decades. The house where they'd raised their children, celebrated their successes, weathered their storms. The house that was now just hers. She walked to the window and watched Richard's Mercedes pull out of their circular driveway, its headlights sweeping across the carefully maintained gardens they'd planted together in their 40s. The roses were nearly finished for the season, their blooms faded and dropping petals onto the mulch below. But roses, Eleanor remembered, had remarkable root systems. They could survive almost anything, as long as their foundations remained strong. She returned to her reading chair and picked up her needlepoint. The pink roses in the garden scene seemed to mock her now, but she continued stitching anyway. Her hands were steady, her breathing even. Inside, she felt something shifting, the first stirrings of an emotion that wasn't grief or shock. It was something much more dangerous. It was calculation. Eleanor had expected to sleep poorly, but instead she'd fallen into the deep, dreamless sleep of exhaustion. She woke at 6:15, 15 minutes before her usual time, and for a brief, merciful moment, forgot that everything had changed. Then she reached across the bed out of 50 years of habit and found only cold sheets and Richard's absent impression in the mattress. The phone began ringing at 7:30. Mom? Victoria's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. I'm coming over. Don't talk to anyone until I get there. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. She'd made a full pot out of habit, enough for 2, and studied her reflection in the kitchen window. She looked exactly the same as yesterday, which seemed impossible. Shouldn't devastating betrayal leave visible marks? Victoria, I'm fine. You don't need to. Like hell you're fine. Dad called me at 6 this morning. 6, Mom. Do you know what he told me? Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. He said you two had grown apart, and that he was pursuing new opportunities for happiness. Like you were a failed business venture he was shutting down. Eleanor closed her eyes. Even in delivering the news to their children, Richard had used corporate speak to sanitize his actions. What exactly did he tell you? Enough. I'm an attorney, remember? I know what pursuing new opportunities means when a 74-year-old man suddenly needs his own apartment. The sound of car doors slamming came through the phone. I'm in your driveway. We need to talk. Victoria burst through the front. Dosser with the force of a woman who'd inherited both her father's determination and her mother's steel spine. At 48, she was striking rather than beautiful, tall like Eleanor, with Richard's strong jaw and eyes that missed nothing. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore the kind of tailored suit that announced she was someone to be taken seriously. Mom. She wrapped Eleanor in a fierce hug that smelled of expensive perfume and righteous anger. I am so sorry, and I am so furious I could burn down his office building. Victoria. No. Let me say this first. Victoria pulled back, her hands gripping Eleanor's shoulders. I should have said something years ago. I should have told you what I suspected. But I kept hoping I was wrong, kept thinking that surely Dad wouldn't be stupid enough to risk everything for some midlife crisis fantasy. Eleanor's stomach dropped. You knew? I suspected. The late meetings, the unexplained charges on the business credit cards, the way he started dressing differently, caring about his appearance again. Victoria's mouth formed a hard line. I'm a divorce attorney, Mom. I see the signs every day. But he's my father, and you seemed happy, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Before Eleanor could respond, another car pulled into the driveway. Jimmy emerged from his sensible Honda, moving with the careful gait of a man trying to navigate a minefield. At 45, he looked older than his age, with Richard's receding hairline and Eleanor's gentle eyes. He wore khakis and a polo shirt, the uniform of a man who'd never quite figured out how to be comfortable in his own skin. Mom. He kissed her cheek awkwardly, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Victoria. How are you holding up? She's holding up like a woman whose husband of 50 years just abandoned her for his secretary, Victoria snapped. Jimmy winced. Victoria, please. This is hard enough without what? Without acknowledging what Dad actually did? Without calling it what it is? Without making it worse for Mom than it already is? Jimmy's voice carried the weary patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime mediating between his father's ambitions and his family's needs. Fighting isn't going to help anyone. Eleanor watched her children square off in her living room, the same room where Richard had delivered his devastating news just 12 hours earlier. Victoria, fierce and protective, ready to wage war. Jimmy, gentle and conflict-averse, trying to keep the peace even now. Where's your sister? Eleanor asked. Jimmy and Victoria exchanged glances. Maggie's. Processing, Jimmy said carefully. She's in denial, Victoria translated. She thinks this is somehow your fault. As if summoned by their words, the front door opened again. Margaret, Maggie, swept in with the dramatic flair that had defined her since childhood. At 42, she was the most beautiful of Eleanor's children, with Richard's charisma and her own artistic sensibility. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and she wore flowing clothes that somehow managed to look both expensive and bohemian. Mother. Her voice carried a chill that made Eleanor's chest tighten. I suppose you're satisfied now. Maggie, Jimmy warned. What? We're all thinking it. Dad finally got tired of walking on eggshells around her controlling behavior and found someone who actually appreciates him. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt Victoria tense beside her, ready to defend, but Eleanor held up a hand. Controlling behavior, Eleanor repeated quietly. Don't act innocent. You've spent 50 years managing Dad's life, organizing his schedule, telling him what he could and couldn't do. Is it any wonder he found someone who actually supports his dreams instead of limiting them? Eleanor studied her youngest daughter, the child she'd worried about most, the one who'd struggled with addiction and never quite found her way, the one Richard had always indulged, always rescued, always enabled. Tell me, Maggie, Eleanor said, her voice carrying a new edge that made all three of her children look at her sharply. When exactly did I limit your father's dreams? When I gave up my career to raise you children? When I entertained his clients and managed his household so he could focus on business? When I smiled and played the perfect wife while he built his empire? That's not what I... Or are you referring to the times I suggested he might want to attend your school plays or Jimmy's baseball games or Victoria's graduation instead of working? Is that the controlling behavior you're talking about? Maggie's face flushed. You don't understand. Dad needs someone who gets his vision for the future. Someone young and ambitious who can help him grow instead of holding him back. Someone young, Eleanor repeated. You mean someone like Melissa? Chen, his 35-year-old secretary. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. She'd made a full pot out of habit, enough for two, and studied her reflection in the kitchen window. She looked exactly the same as yesterday, which seemed impossible. Shouldn't devastating betrayal leave? Visible marks? Victoria, I'm fine. You don't need to... Like hell you're fine. Dad called me at 6 this morning. 6, Mom. Do you know what he told me? Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. He said you two had grown apart and that he was pursuing new opportunities for happiness. Like you were a failed business venture he was shutting down. Eleanor closed her eyes. Even in delivering the news to their children, Richard had used corporate speak to sanitize his actions. What exactly did he tell you? Enough. I'm an attorney, remember? I know what pursuing new opportunities means when a 74-year-old man suddenly needs his own apartment. The sound of car doors slamming came through the phone. I'm in your driveway. We need to talk. Victoria burst through the front door with the force of a woman who'd inherited both her father's determination and her mother's steel spine. At 48, she was striking rather than beautiful, tall like Eleanor, with Richard's strong jaw and eyes that missed nothing. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore the kind of tailored suit that announced she was someone to be taken seriously. Mom. She wrapped Eleanor in a fierce hug that smelled of expensive perfume and righteous anger. I am so sorry, and I am so furious I could burn down his office building. Victoria? No, let me say this first. Victoria pulled back, her hands gripping Eleanor's shoulders. I should have said something years ago. I should have told you what I suspected. But I kept hoping I was wrong. Kept thinking that surely Dad wouldn't be stupid enough to risk everything for some midlife crisis fantasy. Eleanor's stomach dropped. You knew? I suspected. The late meetings, the unexplained charges on the business credit cards, the way he started dressing differently, caring about his appearance again. Victoria's mouth formed a hard line. I'm a divorce attorney, Mom. I see the signs every day. But he's my father, and you seemed happy, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Before Eleanor could respond, another car pulled into the driveway. Jimmy emerged from his sensible Honda, moving with the careful gait of a man trying to navigate a minefield. At 45, he looked older than his age, with Richard's receding hairline and Eleanor's gentle eyes. He wore khakis and a polo shirt, the uniform of a man who'd never quite figured out how to be comfortable in his own skin. Mom. He kissed her cheek awkwardly, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Victoria. How are you holding up? She's holding up like a woman whose husband of 50 years just abandoned her for his secretary, Victoria snapped. Jimmy winced. Victoria, please. This is hard enough without what? Without acknowledging what Dad actually did? Without calling it what it is? Without making it worse for Mom than it already is. Jimmy's voice carried the weary patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime mediating between his father's ambitions and his family's needs. Fighting isn't going to help anyone. Eleanor watched her children square off in her living room, the same room where Richard had delivered his devastating news just 12 hours earlier. Victoria, fierce and protective, ready to wage war. Jimmy, gentle and conflict-averse, trying to keep the peace even now. "Where's your sister?" Eleanor asked. Jimmy and Victoria exchanged glances. "Maggie's." "Processing," Jimmy said carefully. "She's in denial," Victoria translated. "She thinks this is somehow your fault." As if summoned by their words, the front door opened again. Margaret, Maggie, swept in with the dramatic flair that had defined her since childhood. At 42, she was the most beautiful of Eleanor's children, with Richard's charisma and her own artistic sensibility. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and she wore flowing clothes that somehow managed to look both expensive and bohemian. Mother. Her voice carried a chill that made Eleanor's chest tighten. "I suppose you're satisfied now." "Maggie," Jimmy warned. "What? We're all thinking it. Dad finally got tired of walking on eggshells around her controlling behavior and found someone who actually appreciates him." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt Victoria tense beside her, ready to defend. But Eleanor held up a hand. "Controlling behavior," Eleanor repeated quietly. "Don't act innocent. You've spent 50 years managing Dad's life, organizing his schedule, telling him what he could and couldn't do. Is it any wonder he found someone who actually supports his dreams instead of limiting them?" Eleanor studied her youngest daughter, the child she'd worried about most, the one who'd struggled with addiction and never quite found her way, the one Richard had always indulged, always rescued, always enabled. "Tell me, Maggie," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a new edge that made all three of her children look at her sharply. "When exactly did I limit your father's dreams? When I gave up my career to raise you children? When I entertained his clients and managed his household so he could focus on business? When I smiled and played the perfect wife while he built his empire? That's not what I... Or are you referring to the times I suggested he might want to attend your school plays, or Jimmy's baseball games, or Victoria's graduation instead of working? Is that the controlling behavior you're talking about?" Maggie's face flushed. "You don't understand. Dad needs someone who gets his vision for the future. Someone young and ambitious who can help him grow instead of holding him back." "Someone young," Eleanor repeated. "You mean someone like Melissa?" Chen, his 35-year-old secretary. "She has an MBA from Wharton. She's not just some secretary." Eleanor looked at her youngest daughter, this woman she'd raised and worried over and protected, and saw Richard reflected in her features. The same entitlement, the same ability to rationalize betrayal as justified ambition. "Get out." The words came out quiet but unmistakable. Maggie blinked in surprise. "What?" "I said, get out of my house." Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "If you think your father's behavior is acceptable, if you think I deserve to be abandoned for a woman young enough to be his daughter, then you're not welcome here." "Mom," Jimmy started. "No." Eleanor stood, and for the first time since Richard's announcement, she felt truly powerful. "I have spent 50 years putting everyone else's needs before my own. I have smiled and sacrificed and supported and enabled. But I will not stand in my own home and listen to my daughter blame me for my husband's infidelity." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. But Eleanor felt no softening. You want to side with your father? Fine. But don't expect me to comfort you when you discover what kind of man he really is. Maggie fled, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the family photos on the mantelpiece. In the silence that followed, Eleanor became aware of Victoria and Jimmy staring at her with expressions she'd never seen before. Mom, Victoria said slowly, I've never heard you talk like that. Eleanor looked at her remaining children, Victoria, fierce and loyal, Jimmy, gentle but conflicted, and realized they were seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as their patient, long-suffering mother, but as a woman with her own strength and limits. There are a lot of things you've never seen me do, Eleanor said, starting with protecting myself. She walked to the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in months but still knew by heart. Harold? It's Eleanor Hartwell. I need to see you today. Yes, it's about Richard. And Harold? I'm going to need you to dig out our prenuptial agreement. It's time you reminded me exactly what I negotiated 50 years ago. After Victoria and Jimmy left, both promising to return later with practical help and emotional support, Eleanor found herself truly alone for the first time since Richard's announcement. The house felt different now, larger somehow, as if his absence had created physical space where none had existed before. She could hear the subtle sounds that had always been masked by his presence. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock, the whisper of wind through the maple trees outside. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, her hand trailing along the polished banister they'd chosen together 30 years ago when they'd renovated the Colonial. At the end of the hallway was her study, the one room in the house that had always been unquestionably hers. Richard had his home office downstairs with its mahogany desk and walls lined with business awards and photographs of himself with various politicians and developers. But Eleanor's study was smaller, quieter, filled with the books she actually read and the mementos that mattered to her personally. Her desk was antique cherry wood, inherited from her grandmother. The walls held watercolors she'd painted in her 40s, family photographs from before the children grew up and moved away, and her framed certificate from the paralegal program she'd completed just before she married Richard. She settled into her reading chair, different from the one downstairs, this one chosen for comfort rather than appearance, and allowed herself to truly feel the weight of what had happened. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by something she couldn't quite name yet. Not anger exactly, though that was certainly there. Something more complex, more purposeful. Her gaze fell on the built-in shelves that lined one wall, filled with photo albums and document boxes she'd maintained meticulously over the decades. Eleanor had always been organized, a trait Richard had praised when it served him and ignored when it revealed inconvenient truths. She rose and pulled down a leather-bound photo album from their early years together. The young woman in these pictures was almost a stranger. Eleanor at 22, her hair dark and worn long, her face unlined and full of the confidence that comes from believing the future will unfold exactly as planned. Here she was on their wedding day, radiant in ivory silk, gazing at Richard with absolute trust. Here they were on their honeymoon in London, her hand in his as they posed in front of Big Ben. Young professionals conquering the world together. She turned the pages slowly, watching their story unfold in carefully arranged photographs. The first apartment, tiny but charming. Richard's early business ventures, Eleanor beside him at company parties, playing the role of supportive wife with genuine enthusiasm. The children's births, Richard looking proud but slightly overwhelmed while Eleanor cradled each baby with natural competence. But as the albums progressed, Eleanor noticed something she'd never consciously observed before. The photographs began to change. Richard appeared in more pictures alone, at ribbon cuttings, award ceremonies, business conferences. When Eleanor appeared with him, she was increasingly in the background, smiling supportively while he commanded the center of attention. By the time they reached their 40s, she was often the one taking the pictures rather than appearing in them. Eleanor closed the album and reached for a document box labeled Legal Personal. She hadn't opened it in years, but she remembered its contents with the precision that came from her legal secretary training: birth certificates, passport, renewals, insurance policies, and buried somewhere within. Her fingers found the manila folder she was looking for. The tab read Prenuptial Agreement, 1975, in her own careful handwriting. Eleanor's heart rate quickened as she opened the folder. The document was exactly as she remembered it: 23 pages of legal language drafted by Harold Brennan when he was a young attorney, and she was a young woman who had learned some hard lessons about trusting others with your financial security. She began to read, and the memories came flooding back with startling clarity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 1974. Eleanor was 21, working as a legal secretary for a small firm in Hartford. She'd moved out of her mother's apartment 6 months earlier, finally able to afford her own place after her mother's financial situation stabilized. It had taken 3 years for Margaret Sullivan to recover from the devastation her husband's abandonment had caused. Eleanor's father had left on a Tuesday morning in 1971, telling her mother he was going to work. He never came home. The note he left explained that he'd found someone else, someone who understood him better, and that he was starting fresh. What he didn't mention in the note was that he'd systematically drained their joint bank accounts, transferred ownership of their house to his brother for $1, and moved all their investments into accounts that bore only his name. Margaret Sullivan went from comfortable middle-class wife to near poverty overnight. She'd never worked outside the home, had no credit in her own name, and discovered that the legal system of 1971 offered little protection for abandoned wives. She'd spent months fighting for basic survival while her husband enjoyed his new life in California with his 25-year-old girlfriend. Eleanor had watched her mother struggle with a fury that burned cold and steady. She'd sworn she would never be that vulnerable, never put herself in a position where another person's choices could destroy her so completely. Now, reading the prenuptial agreement she'd insisted on despite Richard's protests, Eleanor remembered the determination that had driven her 22-year-old self. The document was far more comprehensive than the standard agreements of the time. She'd researched extensively, consulted with Harold about every clause, and insisted on protections that Richard had laughingly called paranoid. Section 12 caught her attention. In the event of marital dissolution due to adultery committed by the husband, as defined in Section 3A, the wife shall be entitled to 65% of all marital assets, including but not limited to real estate, business interests, investments, and retirement accounts, regardless of the duration of the marriage or the fault-finding statutes of the jurisdiction in which dissolution proceedings are filed. Eleanor's breath caught. 65%. She'd negotiated that clause specifically, over Harold's mild objections and Richard's amused resistance. She'd been thinking of her mother's devastation, but she'd also been thinking strategically. Even at 22, she'd understood that adultery was often a symptom of deeper character flaws, and that a man who would betray his wife's trust might also betray her financially. Section 3A defined adultery broadly. Any sexual or romantic relationship between the husband and any person other than the wife, including but not limited to physical intimacy, emotional affairs, cohabitation, or the provision of gifts, money, or other valuables to any person with whom the husband maintains such a relationship. Eleanor set the document down and walked to her desk. In the bottom drawer, behind files of household receipts and warranty information, was a folder she'd never mentioned to anyone. Not to Richard, not to her children, not even to Harold. She pulled it out and opened it on her desk. Inside were credit card statements dating back 15 years. Not the summaries rich. She'd been building a case. The evidence of Richard's infidelities went back years. Multiple affairs, some brief and apparently meaningless, others longer and involving substantial expenditures. She'd never confronted him, never demanded explanations, never even let on that she knew. She'd simply continued to document, to observe, to quietly compile proof of exactly the kind of behavior her prenuptial agreement had been designed to address. Eleanor sank back into her chair, staring at the evidence spread across her desk. For years, she'd thought of herself as the patient, long-suffering wife who chose to ignore her husband's indiscretions for the sake of their family and marriage. But that wasn't true, was it? She'd been preparing. Without consciously acknowledging it, she'd been building the foundation for exactly this moment. Every receipt saved, every suspicious charge noted, every inconsistency documented. She'd been creating a comprehensive record of Richard's betrayals while maintaining the facade of the devoted wife. The woman Richard had dismissed as a sweet, naive little secretary had been conducting a decades-long investigation into his character, and she'd found him guilty long before he'd ever heard of Melissa Chen. Eleanor reached for her phone and dialed Harold's number again. "Harold, it's Eleanor again. I've been reviewing the prenup. We need to meet tomorrow morning, not next week." "And Harold, bring your calculator. I think you're going to be very surprised by what 65% of Richard's empire looks like these days." She hung up and gathered the documents back into their folders. As she worked, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the antique mirror above her desk. The same face that had looked back at her this morning, but something fundamental had changed in her expression. The devastated wife was gone. In her place sat a woman who had been planning for this war for 25 years. And she was about to win it. Harold Brennan's law office occupied the top floor of a brick building that had anchored downtown Hartford's legal district for over a century. Eleanor had been here dozens of times over the years, for will updates, real estate closings, and the various legal maintenance that accompanied a long marriage and substantial assets. But as she sat in the familiar leather chair across from Harold's mahogany desk, everything felt different. Harold himself looked much the same as he had when he'd drafted her prenup 50 years ago, just with silver hair instead of brown, and lines that spoke of decades spent navigating other people's crises. His sharp eyes held the same intelligence. That had impressed her as a young legal secretary, though now they carried a wariness that came with experience. "Eleanor," he said, settling behind his desk with the prenuptial agreement spread before him. "I have to admit, when you called yesterday, I thought you might be overreacting. 50-year-old agreements don't always hold up the way people expect them to." Eleanor opened her leather portfolio, the same one she'd carried during her working days, and withdrew a manila folder thick with documentation. "I thought you might say that, so I brought some supporting materials." Harold's eyebrows rose as Eleanor began laying out credit card statements, receipts, and a detailed timeline she'd prepared the night before. Each document was precisely organized, cross-referenced, and annotated in her careful handwriting. "This is from 2018, she said, pointing to a restaurant receipt. Le Bernardin in New York. Richard told me he was at a construction conference in Atlantic City that weekend. This charge was for 2 dinners, at 9 p.m. on a Saturday. The conference ended Friday afternoon." She placed another document beside it. "Hotel charges from the same weekend. The W Hotel in Manhattan. Not exactly standard business accommodations for a construction conference in New Jersey." Harold leaned forward, his expression shifting from polite attention to focused interest. "Eleanor, how long have you been collecting this information?" 15 years of active documentation, though I've been observing patterns much longer than that." Eleanor's voice was steady, professional. She felt more like her old self, the competent legal secretary who could organize complex cases and spot inconsistencies than she had in decades. She continued laying out evidence with methodical precision, credit card charges for jewelry that had never appeared in her jewelry box, florist bills for arrangements she'd never received, weekend trips that didn't match Richard's stated business schedule, a pattern of deception that stretched back years and involved multiple women. The most recent activity, Eleanor said, placing a separate stack of documents on Harold's desk, involves charges that clearly relate to Melissa Chen, restaurants, where Richard claims to have eaten alone but paid for 2 meals. A jewelry store charge for $3,200 last month. I received nothing for our anniversary this year. Hotel charges during what he told me were day-long business meetings. Harold was quiet for several minutes, studying the evidence with the concentration of a man who'd spent his career building cases. Finally, he looked up at Eleanor with an expression of genuine amazement. "This is extraordinary," he said. "You've essentially built a prosecutor's case file." The level of detail, the cross-referencing with his stated activities. "Eleanor, this goes far beyond what most people could provide even with professional investigation services. I was a legal secretary for 3 years before I married." "Richard," Eleanor replied, "I may have been out of the workforce for 50 years, but I never forgot how to build a case." Harold picked up the prenuptial agreement and read through it again, this time with obvious care. "I remember you insisting on specific language around adultery, but I'd forgotten how comprehensive your definition was. Most agreements from that era were much more basic. I had very specific concerns about what constituted betrayal," Eleanor said quietly. "My father didn't just leave my mother for another woman. He systematically prepared for his departure by hiding assets and ensuring she'd have no financial recourse. I wanted protection against both the emotional betrayal and the financial manipulation." "And you got it." Harold's voice carried a note of professional admiration. "This clause about gifts and financial support to third parties in the context of romantic relationships. Eleanor, that's remarkably sophisticated for 1975. Hell, it's sophisticated for 2025. He pulled out a calculator and began working through numbers, occasionally referring to files from his cabinet that contained records of Richard's business holdings and assets. Eleanor watched him work, feeling a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. This was what competence felt like. This was what it meant to be prepared. "Eleanor," Harold said finally, "do you understand what 65% of Richard's current assets would represent?" "I have some idea. I've been managing our household finances for 50 years. The real estate development company alone is worth approximately $12 million. The investment portfolio is another $8 million. The real estate holdings, including your home, the vacation house in the Hamptons, and the commercial properties, total roughly $15 million. Then there are retirement accounts, life insurance policies, business partnerships." Harold's calculator clicked steadily as he worked. "We're looking at total marital assets of approximately $42 million. 65% of that is $27,300,000, Eleanor said calmly. Harold stared at her. "You already calculated it." "Last night. I also researched the current legal precedents for enforcing prenuptial agreements in Connecticut, particularly those involving adultery clauses. The Sullivan case from 2019 established that agreements with specific performance clauses, like ours, can supersede no-fault divorce statutes when there's clear evidence of the triggering behavior." For a moment, Harold was silent. Then he began to chuckle, the sound growing into full laughter. "Eleanor Hartwell, you magnificent woman. Richard has no idea what he's unleashed, does he?" "Richard has never taken me seriously," Eleanor replied. "He's viewed me as a pleasant accessory to his life, someone who managed the domestic details while he focused on important matters. He's about to discover that I've been paying attention to those important matters all along." Harold leaned back in his chair, studying Eleanor with new respect. "There's something else you should know. I've been Richard's attorney for business matters over the years, but this creates a conflict of interest. I'll need to recommend someone else to represent him when he realizes what's happening. I assumed as much. Do you think the agreement will hold up in court? Eleanor, with the documentation you've provided and the specific language we used, this agreement isn't just enforceable, it's airtight. Richard signed away his rights to claim ignorance about the consequences of adultery. He agreed to these terms when he married you. Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over her. What's our next step? We file for divorce and invoke the prenuptial agreement. Given the evidence you've provided, I don't see how Richard can contest the adultery claim. But Eleanor, I have to ask, are you prepared for his reaction? Men like Richard don't handle financial consequences well, especially when they realize they've been outmaneuvered. Eleanor thought of Richard's patronizing smile when she'd mentioned the prenup, his dismissive comment about her sweet gesture at being modern. She thought of 50 years of being underestimated, overlooked, and taken for granted. Harold, she said, I've been preparing for Richard's reaction for 25 years. The question is whether he's prepared for mine. Harold nodded slowly. Then let's begin. I'll have the papers drawn up by tomorrow afternoon. Fair warning. Once we file these documents, there's no going back. This will become very public, very quickly. Good, Eleanor said, gathering her evidence back into neat stacks. Richard has spent 50 years believing that his private behavior wouldn't have public consequences. It's time he learned otherwise. As she prepared to leave, Harold asked, one final question. Eleanor, can I ask what changed? You could have confronted him about these affairs years ago. Why now? Eleanor paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. Because now he's made his choice public. Richard didn't just betray our marriage. He announced his intention to replace me with a younger model. The difference between private infidelity and public humiliation is the difference between patience and dignity. She opened the door, then looked back at Harold one more time. Besides, Melissa Chen isn't the first woman Richard has believed he could upgrade to. She's just the first one he's been foolish enough to leave me for. Eleanor walked out of Harold's office feeling more powerful than she had in decades. Phase 1 was complete. She'd established the legal foundation for her counterattack. Now, it was time for Phase 2, making sure Richard understood exactly what game they were really playing. Harold Brennan's law office occupied the top floor of a brick building that had anchored downtown Hartford's legal district for over a century. Eleanor had been here dozens of times over the years, for will updates, real estate closings, and the various legal maintenance that accompanied a long marriage and substantial assets. But as she sat in the familiar leather chair across from Harold's mahogany desk, everything felt different. Harold himself looked much the same as he had when he'd drafted her prenup 50 years ago, just with silver hair instead of brown and lines that spoke of decades spent navigating other people's crises. His sharp eyes held the same intelligence that had impressed her as a young legal secretary, though now they carried a wariness that came with experience. Eleanor, he said, settling behind his desk with the prenuptial agreement spread before him. I have to admit, when you called yesterday, I thought you might be overreacting. 50-year-old agreements don't always hold up the way people expect them to. Eleanor opened her leather portfolio, the same one she'd carried during her working days, and withdrew a manila folder thick with documentation. I thought you might say that, so I brought some supporting materials. Harold's eyebrows rose as Eleanor began laying out credit card statements, receipts, and a detailed timeline she'd prepared the night before. Each document was precisely organized, cross-referenced, and annotated in her careful handwriting. This is from 2018, she said, pointing to a restaurant receipt. Le Bernardin in New York. Richard told me he was at a construction conference in Atlantic City that weekend. This charge was for 2 dinners at 9 p.m. on a Saturday. The conference ended Friday afternoon. She placed another document beside hotel charges from the same weekend. The W Hotel in Manhattan, Not exactly standard business accommodations for a construction conference in New Jersey. Harold leaned forward, his expression shifting from polite attention to focused interest. Eleanor, how long have you been collecting this information? 15 years of active documentation, though I've been observing patterns much longer than that. Eleanor's voice was steady, professional. She felt more like her old self, the competent legal secretary who could organize complex cases and spot inconsistencies, than she had in decades. She continued laying out evidence with methodical precision. Credit card charges for jewelry that had never appeared in her jewelry box. Florist bills for arrangements she'd never received. Weekend trips that didn't match Richard's stated business schedule. A pattern of deception that stretched back years and involved multiple women. The most recent activity, Eleanor said, placing a separate stack of documents on Harold's desk, involves charges that clearly relate to Melissa Chen. Restaurants, where Richard claims to have eaten alone but paid for 2 meals. A jewelry store charge for $3,200 last month. I received nothing for our anniversary this year. Hotel charges during what he told me were day-long business meetings. Harold was quiet for several minutes, studying the evidence with the concentration of a man who'd spent his career building cases. Finally, he looked up at Eleanor with an expression of genuine amazement. "This is extraordinary," he said. "You've essentially built a prosecutor's case file." The level of detail, the cross-referencing with his stated activities. Eleanor, this goes far beyond what most people could provide even with professional investigation services. I was a legal secretary for 3 years before I married. Richard, Eleanor replied, I may have been out of the workforce for 50 years, but I never forgot how to build a case. Harold picked up the prenuptial agreement and read through it again, this time with obvious care. I remember you insisting on specific language around adultery, but I'd forgotten how comprehensive your definition was. Most agreements from that era were much more basic. I had very specific concerns about what constituted betrayal, Eleanor said quietly. My father didn't just leave my mother for another woman. He systematically prepared for his departure by hiding assets and ensuring she'd have no financial recourse. I wanted protection against both the emotional betrayal and the financial manipulation. And you got it. Harold's voice carried a note of professional admiration. This clause about gifts and financial support to third parties in the context of romantic relationships. Eleanor, that's remarkably sophisticated for 1975. Hell, it's sophisticated for 2025. He pulled out a calculator and began working through numbers, occasionally referring to files from his cabinet that contained records of Richard's business holdings and assets. Eleanor watched him work, feeling a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. This was what competence felt like. This was what it meant to be prepared. Eleanor, Harold said finally, do you understand what 65% of Richard's current assets would represent? I have some idea. I've been managing our household finances for 50 years. The real estate development company alone is worth approximately $12 million. The investment portfolio is another $8 million. The real estate holdings, including your home, the vacation house in the Hamptons, and the commercial properties, total roughly $15 million. Then there are retirement accounts, life insurance policies, business partnerships. Harold's calculator clicked steadily as he worked. We're looking at total marital assets of approximately $42 million. 65% of that is $27,300,000, Eleanor said calmly. Harold stared at her. You already calculated it. Last night, I also researched the current legal precedents for enforcing prenuptial agreements in Connecticut, particularly those involving adultery clauses. The Sullivan case from 2019 established that agreements with specific performance clauses, like ours, can supersede no-fault divorce statutes when there's clear evidence of the triggering behavior. For a moment, Harold was silent. Then he began to chuckle, the sound growing into full laughter. "Eleanor Hartwell, you magnificent woman. Richard has no idea what he's unleashed, does he?" "Richard has never taken me seriously," Eleanor replied. "He's viewed me as a pleasant accessory to his life, someone who managed the domestic details while he focused on important matters. He's about to discover that I've been paying attention to those important matters all along." Harold leaned back in his chair, studying Eleanor with new respect. "There's something else you should know. I've been Richard's attorney for business matters over the years, but this creates a conflict of interest. I'll need to recommend someone else to represent him when he realizes what's happening." "I assumed as much. Do you think the agreement will hold up in court?" "Eleanor, with the documentation you've provided and the specific language we used, this agreement isn't just enforceable. It's airtight. Richard signed away his rights to claim ignorance about the consequences of adultery. He agreed to these terms when he married you." Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over her. "What's our next step?" "We file for divorce and invoke the prenuptial agreement. Given the evidence you've provided, I don't see how Richard can contest the adultery claim. But Eleanor, I have to ask, are you prepared for his reaction? Men like Richard don't handle financial consequences well, especially when they realize they've been outmaneuvered." Eleanor thought of Richard's patronizing smile when she'd mentioned the prenup, his dismissive comment about her sweet gesture at being modern. She thought of 50 years of being underestimated, overlooked, and taken for granted. "Harold," she said, "I've been preparing for Richard's reaction for 25 years. The question is whether he's prepared for mine." Harold nodded slowly. "Then let's begin. I'll have the papers drawn up by tomorrow afternoon. Fair warning, once we file these documents, there's no going back. This will become very public, very quickly." "Good," Eleanor said, gathering her evidence back into neat stacks. "Richard has spent 50 years believing that his private behavior wouldn't have public consequences. It's time he learned otherwise." As she prepared to leave, Harold asked, "One final question. Eleanor, can I ask what changed? You could have confronted him about these affairs years ago. Why now?" Eleanor paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. "Because now he's made his choice public. Richard didn't just betray our marriage. He announced his intention to replace me with a younger model. The difference between private infidelity and public humiliation is the difference between patience and dignity." She opened the door, then looked back at Harold one more time. "Besides, Melissa Chen isn't the first woman Richard has believed he could upgrade to. She's just the first one he's been foolish enough to leave me for." Eleanor walked out of Harold's office feeling more powerful than she had in decades. Phase 1 was complete. She'd established the legal foundation for her counterattack. Now it was time for Phase 2, making sure Richard understood exactly what game they were really playing. Eleanor spent the next 3 days in what she privately called reconnaissance mode, while Harold prepared the legal documents that would formally activate her prenuptial agreement. She embarked on a systematic investigation that would have impressed her old supervisors at the law firm. Years of managing Richard's business, entertaining, and social calendar had given her access to information most wives never possessed, and decades of careful observation had taught her where to look for the truth behind his carefully constructed lies. Victoria arrived Wednesday morning with coffee and a legal pad, ready to assist in what she'd dubbed Operation Prenup. Eleanor had been reluctant to involve her daughter in the more sordid details of her father's infidelities, but Victoria's expertise in family law and her existing suspicions about Richard's behavior made her an invaluable ally. "I've been thinking about this all night," Victoria said, settling at Eleanor's kitchen table with the focused intensity she brought to her most complex cases. "If Dad's been this sloppy about covering his tracks with Melissa, he's probably been equally careless with previous affairs. We need to build a comprehensive timeline." Eleanor spread her meticulously organized files across the table. I've already begun. Look at this pattern from 2019. She pointed to a series of credit card statements and calendar entries she'd cross-referenced. Richard claimed he was attending a real estate conference in Chicago in March. But here's a charge for dinner at a restaurant in Boston the same weekend, and here's a hotel charge for 2 nights at the Four Seasons. The conference was actually a 3-day event, but he was only gone 1 night according to our home calendar. Victoria studied the documents with her attorney's eye for detail. This isn't just infidelity, Mom. This is systematic deception involving business expenses. If he's been using company funds for personal affairs, that opens up additional legal avenues. Eleanor had already considered this angle. I've separated the personal credit card charges from the business expenses. There's overlap, but the pattern suggests he's been more careful about business funds, mostly. She pulled out another folder, this one containing bank statements and investment records. However, there are some interesting discrepancies in our joint investment accounts. Several large withdrawals over the past 2 years that don't correspond to any major purchases or expenses I'm aware of. Victoria's eyes sharpened. How large? $47,000 in total, withdrawn in amounts just under $10,000 to avoid automatic reporting requirements. That's not casual spending money. That's serious financial planning. Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying her mother with obvious admiration. Mom, you've essentially been conducting a forensic accounting investigation. Where did you learn to do this? Eleanor smiled thinly. Your father never understood what I actually did during my 3 years as a legal secretary. I wasn't just answering phones and typing letters. I was organizing evidence, tracking financial records, and preparing cases for trial. I may have been young, but I was very good at my job. She pulled out her laptop, a recent purchase that had surprised Richard, who'd assumed she had no interest in technology, and opened a spreadsheet that would have impressed a professional investigator. I've been tracking Richard's patterns for years, but I only recently understood what I was looking at. The frequency of his business meetings that ran late, the weekend conferences that seemed to multiply every year, the gifts and expenditures that didn't match any special occasions in our family calendar. Victoria scrolled through the spreadsheet, her expression growing grimmer with each entry. Mom, this shows at least 5 separate affairs over the past decade. Some overlapping, some sequential. This isn't a man having a midlife crisis. This is someone who's made infidelity a lifestyle. Eleanor nodded. That's what I realized when I started compiling everything systematically. Richard didn't suddenly fall for Melissa and decide to leave me. He's been practicing leaving me for years, just in smaller increments. The phone rang, interrupting their analysis. Eleanor glanced at the caller ID and felt her stomach tighten. It's Jimmy. Mom? Jimmy's voice carried the careful tone he used when delivering news he knew wouldn't be well received. I need to talk to you about something, about the business. What about it? Dad's been restructuring some things, moving assets around, changing account authorizations. I'm not sure what it means, but I thought you should know. Eleanor met Victoria's gaze across the table. What kind of restructuring? He's transferred some of the commercial properties into a separate LLC, changed the signatory requirements on several business accounts, and Jimmy paused, clearly uncomfortable. He's added Melissa as an authorized user on the company credit card. Victoria's face darkened. When did this happen? The changes started about 6 months ago, but they've accelerated in the past few weeks. Mom, I think Dad's been planning this for a lot longer than he let on. Eleanor felt a cold clarity settle over her. Jimmy, I need you to document everything you can access. Account changes, property transfers, new authorizations, can buy. You do that without alerting your father. Yes, I think so. But Mom, if this gets out, if there's a big legal battle, It could affect the whole company, the employees, the ongoing projects, everything. Eleanor heard the plea in her son's voice, the same tone he'd used as a child when trying to prevent his parents from fighting. But this wasn't a domestic squabble that could be smoothed over with compromise and good intentions. Jimmy, your father has been systematically preparing to abandon this family while protecting his own financial interests. He's not thinking about the employees or the projects or anyone except himself and his new girlfriend. I'm not going to stand by and let him destroy what we built together just so he can start fresh with someone else's youth. After Jimmy hung up, Eleanor turned back to her investigation with renewed purpose. If Richard had been moving assets and restructuring his business holdings, he'd been planning this betrayal for months, possibly years. The spontaneous decision to leave her for true love was actually a calculated business plan. Victoria helped her expand the investigation into Richard's business activities, using her legal resources to access public records and corporate filings. What they discovered painted a picture of a man who'd been methodically preparing for divorce while maintaining the facade of a stable marriage. Property transfers to new LLCs, changes in business partnerships that reduced Eleanor's potential claims, investment accounts that had been restructured to make them harder to trace and divide. Richard hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been conducting financial warfare against a wife who he assumed would never fight back. "Mom," Victoria said, studying a corporate filing dated 8 months earlier. "He's been planning this since before Melissa. Look at these dates. The initial restructuring happened before her MBA program ended. He was preparing to leave you before he even decided who he was leaving you for." Eleanor stared at the evidence of her husband's calculated betrayal, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not heartbreak this time, but something colder and more focused. Richard had spent months, possibly years, preparing for this moment. He'd assumed she would be caught off guard, financially vulnerable, and emotionally devastated. He'd been right about the emotional devastation, at least initially, but he'd catastrophically underestimated everything else. "Victoria," Eleanor said, "call Harold and tell him we need an emergency meeting, and ask him to bring someone who specializes in forensic accounting. If Richard wants to play financial games, he's about to discover he picked the wrong opponent." Eleanor gathered her evidence back into neat stacks, each folder representing years of careful observation and documentation. Richard had been planning his escape, but she'd been building her fortress. Now it was time to see which strategy would prove more effective. The war Richard had started in secret was about to become very public indeed. Eleanor chose the Woodmont Country Club for their meeting with the same strategic precision her younger self had once applied to legal research. The club represented 30 years of shared membership, countless business dinners where she'd played the perfect wife, and a social standing that Richard valued perhaps more than anything else. If she was going to destroy his carefully constructed world, she wanted to do it somewhere that would amplify the devastation. She arrived 15 minutes early, requesting their usual table by the windows overlooking the 18th green. The maître d' Charles had known them for decades and greeted her with the subtle deference reserved for long-standing members. "Will Mr. Hartwell be joining you today, Mrs. Hartwell?" "He will," Eleanor replied, settling into her chair with the leather portfolio containing everything that would end Richard's comfortable life. "And Charles, we'll need complete privacy for our conversation." Eleanor had dressed with particular care that morning. The navy blue suit was one Richard had always complimented, tailored and elegant in a way that spoke of quality without ostentation. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her jewelry understated but expensive. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman of substance and breeding who commanded respect. She was reviewing her notes one final time when Richard appeared in the dining room doorway. Even at 74, he cut an impressive figure, tall, distinguished, with the kind of commanding presence that had served him well in business and social situations. He moved through the club with the confidence of a man who belonged everywhere. He went, but Eleanor noticed things about him she'd never consciously observed before. The way his eyes immediately swept the room to see who was present, cataloging potential business contacts and social opportunities. The practiced smile he offered to other members, calibrated to convey just the right amount of warmth without commitment. The way he approached their table with the measured stride of someone always conscious of being watched. "Eleanor," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek in a show of affection that would reassure any observers. Up close, she could smell his cologne, a new scent she didn't recognize. Something younger, more aggressive than his usual choice. "Richard, thank you for meeting me." He settled into his chair with visible wariness. "You sounded different on the phone. I hope you've had time to think about our situation more rationally." Eleanor smiled, the expression carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Oh, I've been thinking very rationally. More rationally than I have in years, actually." Richard relaxed slightly, misreading her composure as acceptance. "Good. I know this is difficult. But I think once we work out the details, you'll see that this is best for everyone. We can handle this amicably, without unnecessary drama." "Amicably," Eleanor repeated, opening her portfolio. "Yes, let's discuss handling this amicably." She withdrew the first document, a copy of their prenuptial agreement, and placed it on the table between them. Richard glanced at it with the dismissive smile she'd expected. "Eleanor, we've been through this. That old thing isn't worth the paper it's printed on after 50 years. Actually, it is." Harold reviewed it with a fine-tooth comb. Connecticut law fully supports the enforcement of prenuptial agreements with specific performance clauses, particularly when there's documented evidence of the triggering behavior. Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Triggering behavior?" Eleanor withdrew the second document, a detailed timeline of his infidelities dating back 15 years. "Adultery, as defined in Section 3A of our agreement. Any sexual or romantic relationship between the husband and any person other than the wife, including but not limited to physical intimacy, emotional affairs, cohabitation, or the provision of gifts, money, or other valuables to any person with whom the husband maintains such a relationship." She began laying out credit card statements, hotel receipts, and restaurant charges with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Le Bernardin, November 2018. You told me you were at a construction conference in Atlantic City. The conference ended Friday afternoon, but you charged dinner for two in Manhattan on Saturday night." Richard's face had gone pale. "Eleanor, you can't be serious. The W Hotel, same weekend. Presidential suite for 2 nights. Florist charges for arrangements I never received. Jewelry purchases that never appeared in my jewelry box." Eleanor's voice remained perfectly calm, professional. "Shall I continue? Or would you prefer to skip ahead to the more recent evidence involving Melissa Chen?" She placed a photograph on the table, a copy of a social media post showing Richard and Melissa at a restaurant Eleanor recognized from their credit card statements. "This was taken 3 months ago. You told me you were having dinner with the Morrison clients to discuss their new development. But the Morrison dinner was the following week, wasn't it?" Richard reached for the documents, his hands visibly shaking. "Where did you get all this?" "I've been collecting evidence for 15 years, Richard. Every suspicious charge, every inconsistent story, every weekend conference that didn't match the industry calendars I could access. Did you really think I was so oblivious that I wouldn't notice patterns? You've been spying on me?" Eleanor's laugh was genuinely amused. "Spying? Richard, I've been paying attention. There's a difference between surveillance and simply not being willfully blind to your husband's behavior." Richard began flipping through the evidence, his expression growing more panicked with each revelation. "This is, Eleanor, some of these charges. They're not what they look like. Which ones? The hotel charges for rooms I never stayed in. The jewelry purchases for gifts I never received. The restaurant bills for romantic dinners I never attended? Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Or perhaps you'd like to explain the $47,000 you've withdrawn from our joint investment accounts over the past 2 years. Richard's head snapped up. How do you know about your secret financial planning? The same way I know about the property transfers, the business restructuring, and the new LLC accounts you've been establishing. Richard, I may have been a housewife for 50 years, but I was a legal secretary before that. I know how to follow a paper trail. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of golf carts and the gentle clink of silverware from other tables. Richard stared at the evidence spread before him, his face cycling through shock, anger, and what Eleanor recognized as genuine fear. "What do you want?" he asked finally. Eleanor withdrew the final document from her portfolio, a copy of the divorce petition Harold had prepared. Section 12 of our prenuptial agreement specifies that in the event of adultery, I'm entitled to 65% of all marital assets. Based on current valuations, that's approximately $27 million. Richard's face went white. 27. Eleanor, that would destroy everything I've built. Everything we built, Richard. Everything we built together over 50 years while you were planning your exit strategy. Eleanor's voice carried steel now, the quiet authority of someone who held all the cards and knew it. You wanted to leave me for a younger woman? Fine. But you're going to pay exactly the price you agreed to pay when you signed that prenuptial agreement. Eleanor, please. Think about the children, the business, the employees who depend on... Now, you're concerned about collateral damage? Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Where was that concern when you were restructuring assets to hide them from me? When you were adding your girlfriend to company credit cards? When you were planning to abandon your family for a fresh start with someone young enough to be your daughter? Richard reached across the table, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Eleanor, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers. We don't need to make this public. I'll be fair. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Eleanor pulled her hands back from his reach. Richard, you've misunderstood something fundamental about our situation. This isn't a negotiation. This is me informing you of the consequences of choices you made years ago. She gathered her documents back into the portfolio with calm efficiency. The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow morning. The prenuptial agreement will be enforced in full. And Richard? Every person in this room, every member of this club, every business associate you've cultivated over the years, they're all going to know exactly why you're losing everything. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that showed no tremor whatsoever. You wanted a new life, Richard. Congratulations. You're about to get exactly what you asked for. She walked away from the table without looking back, leaving Richard surrounded by the evidence of his own destruction. Behind her, she could hear him calling her name, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Eleanor Hartwell had spent 50 years being underestimated. It was the last mistake Richard would ever make. News of Eleanor's legal action spread through their social circle with the velocity of wildfire in drought season. By Thursday afternoon, less than 24 hours after the divorce papers were filed, Eleanor's phone was ringing constantly. Friends, calling with carefully worded inquiries, acquaintances fishing for details, and business associates of Richard's offering carefully neutral expressions of concern. Eleanor let most calls go to voicemail, but she answered when she saw Patricia Chen's name on the caller ID. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Patricia Chen, Melissa's mother. I think we need to talk. Eleanor had been expecting this call, though she'd imagined it would be angry, defensive, perhaps accusatory. Instead, Patricia's voice carried a weariness that Eleanor recognized. the exhaustion of a woman who'd seen too much of the world to be surprised by men's capacity for selfishness. Mrs. Chen: Yes, I suppose we do. I'm in Hartford on business. Could we meet somewhere private? What I have to say shouldn't be overheard. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in West Hartford, away from the country club circuit where Eleanor's confrontation with Richard had already become the subject of intense speculation. Eleanor arrived first and chose a corner table, positioning herself with a clear view of the entrance. Patricia Chen was smaller than Eleanor had expected, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of understated clothing that spoke of quality without ostentation. She moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing both crisis and routine with equal competence. Mrs. Hartwell, Patricia said, settling across from Eleanor. Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I have to admit, I'm curious about what you want to discuss. Patricia signaled the waitress for coffee before answering. I want to discuss the fact that both our daughters are being manipulated by the same man, and neither of us should let him get away with it. Eleanor blinked in surprise. I'm sorry? My daughter thinks she's in love with your husband. She believes he's going to marry her, travel the world with her, build a new life with her. Patricia's mouth formed a thin line. Your husband thinks he's found a young, naive woman who will boost his ego and make him feel powerful again. They're both wrong, and they're both going to get hurt. Eleanor studied Patricia's face, seeing something she hadn't expected. Not anger at Eleanor for pursuing her legal rights, but frustration with the entire situation. You don't approve of their relationship. I didn't work 16-hour days for 20 years to put my daughter through school so she could become some old man's trophy wife. Patricia's voice carried decades of accumulated steel. Melissa is brilliant, hardworking, and ambitious. She has an MBA from Wharton and the intelligence to build her own empire, but your husband has convinced her that attaching herself to his success is easier than creating her own. Eleanor felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy. How much does she know about the legal proceedings? Enough to be panicking. She called me yesterday crying, talking about how you're trying to destroy their happiness. She thinks this is about jealousy, about an older woman who can't accept being replaced by someone younger and more exciting. And what do you think this is about? Patricia leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. I think this is about a man who's been lying to both of you. My daughter believes Richard is wealthy enough to support the lifestyle he's promised her. She has no idea that losing 65% of his assets will make that impossible. And I suspect you're about to discover some things about your husband's character that will make you question whether destroying him financially is worth the cost to everyone else. Eleanor set down her coffee cup carefully. What do you mean? I mean, Richard Hartwell is exactly the kind of man my ex-husband was. Charming, successful, convinced that his wants justify any amount of collateral damage. Patricia's voice carried bitter experience. My husband left me for a younger woman when Melissa was 12, promised her the world, convinced her she was special, then abandoned her when someone even younger caught his attention 2 years later. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. You think Richard will do the same to Melissa? I know he will. Men like Richard don't leave their wives for love. They leave because they're bored, because they want to feel powerful again, because they've convinced themselves they deserve better. But once the novelty wears off, once Melissa starts having needs and opinions and expectations of her own, he'll start looking for the next upgrade. Eleanor stared out the cafe window, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary lives, and wondered when her own life had become so complicated. Even if you're right, that doesn't change what Richard did to me, to our marriage, to our family. No, it doesn't. And I'm not asking you to forgive him or back down from your legal rights. Patricia reached across the table and touched Eleanor's hand briefly. But I am asking you to consider that there might be a way to get justice, without destroying innocent people in the process. Eleanor looked at this woman, this stranger who should have been her enemy, and saw something unexpected. Not an adversary, but a potential ally. Someone who understood what it meant to be betrayed by a man who justified his selfishness as pursuing happiness. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Richard Hartwell has underestimated both of us. He thinks you're a passive victim who will eventually accept a settlement. He thinks my daughter is a naive trophy who will be grateful for whatever scraps of wealth survive your divorce. Patricia's smile was sharp enough to cut stone. What if we proved him wrong on both counts? Before Eleanor could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Dad's been calling everyone we know, trying to get character witnesses to say you're being vindictive. Jimmy's caught in the middle. Maggie's having a complete breakdown. We need to talk. Eleanor showed the message to Patricia, who read it with growing disgust. He's trying to make you the villain in this story. Of course he is. Richard's never taken responsibility for consequences in his life. Why would he start now? Patricia stood, pulling on her coat with sharp, efficient movements. Mrs. Hartwell, Eleanor, I have a proposition for you. But first, I need to have a very honest conversation with my daughter about the kind of man she's attached herself to. Eleanor gathered her purse, feeling as though she were standing at a crossroads she hadn't expected to encounter. And then? Then we figure out how to make sure Richard Hartwell faces the full consequences of his choices, without letting him drag our daughters down with him. As they parted ways in the parking lot, Eleanor felt something shift in her perspective. She'd been thinking of this battle in terms of herself versus Richard, victim versus perpetrator. But Patricia was right. There were other victims in this story, other women whose lives would be affected by Richard's selfishness and her response to it. The question was whether justice required her to ignore that collateral damage, or whether true justice meant finding a way to protect the innocent while still holding Richard accountable. Eleanor drove home through the autumn afternoon, the trees around her blazing with color that reminded her that even beautiful things had seasons, had endings, had times when they needed to let go of what they'd been to become something new. The war with Richard was far from over. But perhaps she'd just found an unexpected ally in the battle for what came next. Part 8. The Complications. Eleanor returned home to find Jimmy's car in her driveway and her youngest son pacing anxiously on the front porch like a caged animal. His usually composed demeanor, inherited from years of managing his father's volatile moods and his family's complex dynamics, had completely cracked, revealing the worried expression he'd worn as a child whenever his parents' arguments had grown too heated for his natural peacemaker instincts to manage. "Mom, thank God you're here," he said, rushing to help her with her purse as she climbed the porch steps. His hands were shaking slightly, and Eleanor noticed dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well since Richard's announcement. "We need to talk. About the business. About Dad. About everything that's happening." Inside, Eleanor found Victoria waiting in the living room with a stack of legal documents spread across the coffee table, and an expression that promised complicated news. Her eldest daughter had clearly been working since dawn. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of stress, with her hair slightly disheveled and her suit jacket draped over the chair back. The contrast between her children struck Eleanor forcefully. Victoria, fierce and ready for battle with the focused intensity of a prosecutor preparing for trial, and Jimmy, gentle and desperate to find middle ground in a situation that might not have any. "What's happened?" Eleanor asked, settling into her reading chair and noticing how different the house felt with just her children present. Without Richard's commanding presence, the room seemed both larger and more intimate. Jimmy ran his hands through his thinning hair, a gesture inherited directly from Richard that made Eleanor's chest tighten with unwanted memories. "Dad's been making calls all morning, started at 6 a.m. from what I can tell. To investors, to business partners, to the bank, to anyone who's ever had financial dealings with Hartwell Development. He's trying to restructure everything before the legal proceedings can freeze the assets." Victoria looked up from her papers, her lawyer's mind already calculating the implications. Which is not only ethically questionable but potentially illegal, by the way. Harold's filing an emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning to prevent any further asset transfers. But Dad's moving incredibly fast, and some of the damage might already be done. Eleanor felt that familiar chill of recognition, the same calculating coldness she'd experienced when reviewing Richard's decades of deception. It was the feeling of watching a chess opponent reveal their strategy, except this time the stakes were higher than she'd initially understood. "What kind of damage are we talking about?" "He's called in every favor he's accumulated over 30 years in business, Mom," Jimmy said, his voice heavy with reluctance and what Eleanor recognized as genuine fear for his livelihood. "The Riverside Development Project, our biggest contract. This year, worth nearly $8 million. The investors are getting nervous. If Dad's personal assets get tied up in a messy public divorce, they're worried about the company's stability and their return on investment." 27 jobs, Victoria added grimly, consulting her notes. That's how many people work directly for Hartwell Development, not counting the subcontractors and suppliers who depend on the company for regular income. If the business goes under because of Dad's financial manipulations and the resulting legal chaos, they all lose their livelihoods. Some of these people have been with the company for over a decade. Eleanor stared at her children, feeling the weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders like a heavy winter coat. This was exactly the kind of collateral damage she'd tried to avoid throughout her marriage, the reason she'd absorbed Richard's smaller betrayals and maintained the facade of marital harmony. But now the stakes had escalated beyond private humiliation to public destruction. "Jimmy," she said carefully, "are you asking me to abandon my legal rights to protect your father's business? Because if you are, I need you to understand what you're really asking." "I'm not asking you to give up everything you're entitled to," Jimmy replied, his tone growing more urgent. "I'm asking you to consider whether there might be another way to handle this, a way that holds Dad accountable for what he's done without destroying everything we've all worked to build over the past 3 decades. Eleanor was about to respond when the doorbell rang, its chime echoing through the house with unusual loudness. Victoria went to answer it, and Eleanor heard muffled conversation before her daughter returned with a visitor Eleanor hadn't expected. Melissa Chen, looking significantly younger and more vulnerable than Eleanor had imagined based on Richard's descriptions of his sophisticated, ambitious secretary. Melissa stood in the doorway, as if uncertain whether she'd be welcomed or thrown out. Her dark hair was pulled back severely in a professional bun, but several strands had escaped, suggesting she'd been running her hands through it nervously. Her expensive charcoal suit was beautifully tailored, but couldn't quite hide the fact that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a tissue in her left hand. "Mrs. Hartwell," Melissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to intrude on your family time, but I desperately need to talk to you. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now." Eleanor studied this woman, who had unknowingly triggered the destruction of her 50-year marriage. Up close, Melissa was lovely in an understated way, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that came from hard-won education and professional success. She looked nothing like the calculating, gold-digging seductress Eleanor had constructed in her imagination during the long, sleepless hours since Richard's announcement. "Please sit down," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her courtesy. There was something about Melissa's obvious distress that appealed to Eleanor's instinctive compassion, the same impulse that had led her to comfort her children's friends, help struggling neighbors, and maintain civility even when her own world was crumbling. Melissa perched on the edge of the sofa like a bird ready to take flight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I spoke with my mother this afternoon. She told me things about Richard that I didn't know. Things that make me realize how naive I've been about this entire situation." Victoria and Jimmy exchanged meaningful glances, but Eleanor kept her attention focused on Melissa, studying her face for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine distress and what appeared to be dawning comprehension of a situation far more complex than she'd understood. "What kind of things did your mother tell you?" "About his pattern with women, about the other affairs." Melissa's voice cracked slightly, and she pressed the tissue to her eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, I thought I was special. I thought what we had was real. I thought he'd never felt this way about anyone before." Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of sympathy, remembering her own younger self and the absolute certainty she'd once felt about Richard's devotion. "How long have you known about the others?" "Since yesterday afternoon. My mother hired a private investigator when she became suspicious about Richard's intentions toward me." Melissa looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something that might have been embarrassment. "Did you know about me from the beginning? Did you know that we were?" Eleanor considered her answer carefully, aware that her children were listening and that her response might influence how this conversation developed. "I knew Richard was having an affair. I documented enough evidence over the years to be certain of that. I didn't know it was you specifically until he told me he was leaving our marriage." Melissa absorbed this information with visible pain, her face cycling through surprise, hurt, and what looked like genuine shame. "He told me you didn't understand him, that your marriage had been loveless for years, that you'd grown apart, so completely that you were more like roommates than spouses. He said you'd actually be happier without him holding you back from finding someone who truly appreciated you." The familiar sting of Richard's casual cruelty hit Eleanor, but she was surprised to find it felt more like an old scar than a fresh wound. "And what do you believe now?" "I believe Richard Hartwell is extraordinarily good at telling people exactly what they want to hear." Melissa's voice carried a bitterness that aged her beyond her 35 years. "I also believe I've made the most terrible mistake of my life and hurt people I never intended to hurt." Jimmy leaned forward, his business instincts engaging, despite the personal nature of the conversation. "Melissa, what exactly did Dad tell you about his financial situation? About what would happen after the divorce?" "He said it would be amicable, that there was plenty of money for everyone to be comfortable. He promised we'd travel together, Europe, Asia, all the places I'd dreamed of seeing. He said he'd help me start my own consulting business, that we'd build something together." Melissa laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "He never mentioned a prenuptial agreement. He certainly never mentioned 65% of his assets going to his wife." Eleanor exchanged a meaningful look with Victoria, who was taking notes with her lawyer's precision. "He didn't tell you about the prenup at all?" "Not until yesterday, when his attorney called him in what sounded like complete panic." Melissa's composure finally cracked entirely, and tears began flowing freely down her cheeks. "Mrs. Hartwell, I swear to you, I never meant to destroy your marriage. I thought, God, I was so incredibly naive. I thought he was already emotionally divorced from you, that I was just helping him find the courage to make it official." The silence that followed was heavy with complicated emotions. Eleanor looked at this young woman, brilliant, accomplished, and thoroughly manipulated by a man who'd had 50 years to perfect his techniques of persuasion and self-justification. She recognized something of her younger self in Melissa's obvious intelligence, coupled with romantic idealism. "Melissa," Eleanor said quietly, "what do you want now? Why did you come here?" "I want to make this right somehow. I want to undo the damage I've helped cause, even though I know that's probably impossible." Melissa looked directly at Eleanor with an intensity that spoke of genuine desperation. "My mother suggested that maybe we could work together instead of being enemies, that maybe we're both victims of the same man's selfishness." Victoria's legal instincts immediately engaged. "Work together how, exactly?" "I know things about Richard's business dealings that you might not have access to. I've been handling his correspondence, his scheduling, his financial communications with investors and partners for over 2 years now. Melissa's voice grew stronger and more confident as she spoke, revealing glimpses of the MBA graduate who had impressed Richard enough to hire her. If he's been hiding assets or manipulating the business structure to protect himself from divorce proceedings, I probably have records of it. Eleanor felt a spark of the same strategic thinking that had guided her decades-long investigation into Richard's behavior. You're offering to provide evidence against Richard? I'm offering to help you get the justice you deserve without destroying innocent people in the process. Melissa looked around the room, taking in the family photographs and mementos that spoke of decades of shared history. Mrs. Hartwell, I've seen the employee records. I know how many families depend on Hartwell development for their livelihoods. I also know that Richard's been more reckless with the business finances than anyone realizes. Jimmy's face had gone pale, and Eleanor could see him processing the implications of what Melissa was suggesting. What do you mean, reckless? Melissa hesitated, clearly torn between residual loyalty to Richard and growing concern for the broader consequences of his actions. He's been using business accounts to fund personal expenses, not just the credit card I was authorized on for legitimate business purposes, actual business funds diverted to personal use, substantial amounts, going back at least 18 months. How substantial? Victoria asked, her pen poised over her legal pad. Over the past year and a half, approximately $120,000. Melissa's voice was barely audible. Restaurant bills, hotel stays, jewelry purchases, travel expenses that had nothing to do with business. If that comes out in the divorce proceedings, it could trigger an IRS investigation, Victoria finished grimly. Tax evasion, misuse of corporate funds, potential fraud charges, which could destroy the business even faster than the divorce settlement. Eleanor felt the strategic landscape shifting dramatically beneath her feet. Richard's betrayal was far worse than she'd realized, extending beyond personal infidelity into potentially criminal financial behavior. As Eleanor walked out of Harold's office into the crisp October afternoon, she felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 22 years old, the exhilarating terror of complete freedom. Behind her, the legal machinery would continue, turning, finalizing the details of their settlement, and ensuring Richard faced the ongoing consequences of his choices. But ahead of her lay something far more valuable than revenge or justice or even financial security. Ahead lay the opportunity to discover what she might have become if she'd never subordinated her own dreams to someone else's ambitions. Eleanor Hartwell's marriage was over. Her life was just beginning. 6 months after the settlement, Eleanor woke in her sun-drenched bedroom at 7:30, a luxury she'd never allowed herself during 50 years of marriage. The morning light streamed through the windows she'd had enlarged during the renovation, illuminating walls painted in the soft sage green Richard had always dismissed as too bold. The house felt entirely different now, transformed from a museum of their shared past into something that reflected her own taste and personality. She made coffee in the kitchen she'd completely redesigned, choosing warm cherry cabinets over Richard's preferred stark white, and installing the cooking island she'd wanted for decades. The morning routine that had once been shaped by Richard's schedule and preferences now belonged entirely to her. Coffee with real cream, toast with the marmalade she'd made from fruit grown in her expanded garden, and the morning news program she actually enjoyed rather than the financial reports Richard had insisted on watching. At 8:15, her phone rang with a call she'd been expecting. "Eleanor, it's Patricia. Are you ready for our adventure?" Eleanor smiled, gathering her purse and the travel documents that represented something she'd never imagined at 72, a completely new chapter of life. More ready than I've ever been for anything. The friendship with Patricia Chen had been one of the most unexpected gifts of the entire ordeal. Two women who should have been enemies had discovered they shared similar values, complementary strengths, and a mutual appreciation for the kind of strategic thinking that had turned Richard's betrayal into their mutual liberation. Patricia's immigrant work ethic and Eleanor's organizational skills had proven to be a formidable combination. Eleanor drove to Bradley International Airport with the windows down, enjoying the spring air and the freedom of a schedule that belonged entirely to her. The settlement had left her financially secure beyond her wildest dreams, but more importantly, it had given her something she'd never possessed as Richard's wife: complete autonomy to make decisions based on her own interests and values. At the airport, she found Patricia waiting with the efficient competence that had characterized all their interactions. At 62, Patricia was embarking on her own late-life adventure, having sold her successful accounting practice to fund what she called her gap year, the travel and exploration she'd deferred while raising Melissa and building her career. "Italy first," Patricia said as they checked in for their flight. "Then we'll see where the wind takes us." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of discovery for Eleanor. Without Richard's needs and schedule to organize her life around, she'd rediscovered interests and capabilities she'd forgotten she possessed. The watercolor painting she'd abandoned in her 40s had resumed with unexpected passion and growing skill. The book club she'd joined had led to fascinating discussions about literature, philosophy, and ideas she'd never had time to explore during her years as Richard's wife. Most surprisingly, she'd found herself volunteering at the local legal aid clinic, using her organizational skills and hard-won understanding of family law to help other women navigate divorce proceedings. Many of them were younger versions of herself, intelligent, capable women who'd subordinated their own development to support their husbands' ambitions, only to find themselves financially and emotionally vulnerable when those marriages ended. "You understand the system in a way most people never do," the clinic director had told her after Eleanor had successfully helped a client recover hidden assets her husband had attempted to shelter. "You've lived through the experience from both, the personal and strategic sides." Eleanor had discovered that helping other women reclaim their power was deeply satisfying in a way that playing the role of perfect wife had never been. She'd testified as an expert witness in 2 cases, sharing her insights about asset documentation and financial investigation techniques. The quiet legal secretary who'd been buried under 50 years of domestic responsibility had emerged with skills and knowledge that proved genuinely valuable to others. Victoria had thrived in the aftermath of the settlement, using the public attention around the case to build her reputation as an attorney who understood the complex dynamics of long-term marriages and sophisticated asset protection. She'd taken on several high-profile cases, earning recognition as one of Connecticut's most effective family law practitioners. "Mom," Victoria had said during their weekly lunch the previous week, "I need to tell you something. Watching you handle Dad's betrayal, seeing how you turned his attempt to discard you into your own liberation, it's changed how I practice law. I used to think divorce was just about dividing assets and custody arrangements. Now I understand it's about helping people reclaim their identity and their power." Jimmy had surprised everyone by proving remarkably capable of running Hartwell. Development without Richard's domineering oversight. The business had actually grown more profitable under his leadership, as his collaborative management style and genuine concern for employee welfare had improved both morale and efficiency. Several major contractors had specifically requested to work with the company again, citing Jimmy's integrity and reliability. "I never realized how much energy I was spending trying to please Dad and anticipate his reactions," Jimmy had confided to Eleanor. "Running the business based on my own judgment and values is actually much less stressful than constantly trying to read his moods and second-guess his decisions." Even Maggie had eventually come around, though it had taken several months, and what Eleanor suspected was a confrontation with some hard truths about Richard's character. She'd called Eleanor in February, her voice thick with tears, and what might have been the beginnings of real self-awareness. "Mom, I owe you an apology," Maggie had said. "I was so angry about losing Dad's financial support that I blamed you instead of facing the reality of what he'd done. I've been in therapy, working on Well, on understanding why I was so invested in seeing him as the victim in all this. Eleanor had accepted the apology, but more importantly, she'd begun to see Maggie as an adult who was finally taking responsibility for her own choices, rather than as the troubled child who needed endless rescue and enablement. The most intriguing development had been Melissa's trajectory. Rather than being destroyed by her involvement in the scandal, she'd used the experience as a catalyst for genuine self-examination. She'd left the corporate world entirely, using her settlement money to fund a nonprofit organization that provided financial literacy and career development programs for young women from working-class backgrounds. I realized I'd been so focused on attaching myself to someone else's success that I'd never really tested my own capabilities, Melissa had explained during a coffee meeting with Eleanor the previous month. Your mother was right. I was trying to take a shortcut to security instead of building my own foundation. The nonprofit had gained national attention, and Melissa had emerged as a thoughtful advocate for economic independence and personal agency. She'd published several articles about the dangers of defining yourself through relationships rather than personal achievement, drawing on her own experience without betraying the confidentiality agreements that protected everyone involved. As their plane lifted off from Hartford, Eleanor looked down at the landscape that had contained her entire adult life until 6 months ago. The neat suburban developments, the country clubs, the business districts where Richard had built his empire, all of it looked smaller from the air, less significant than it had seemed when it defined the boundaries of her world. Any regrets? Patricia asked, noticing Eleanor's contemplative expression. Eleanor considered the question seriously. About the marriage ending? No. About the way it ended? Sometimes. I regret that it took Richard's betrayal to force me to reclaim my own agency. I regret that I spent 50 years being so invested in being the perfect wife that I forgot to be a complete person. She looked out the window as Connecticut disappeared below them, replaced by the broader landscape of a country she was finally free to explore on her own terms. But I don't regret fighting for what I was owed, and I don't regret discovering that I'm much stronger and more capable than I ever knew. Patricia nodded approvingly. My grandmother used to say that the best revenge against people who underestimate you is to become more than they ever imagined you could be. Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in decades. Then I suppose Richard is about to be very thoroughly revenged upon. The flight attendant announced their cruising altitude, and Eleanor opened the travel journal she'd bought specifically for this trip. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.